A 42-year-old woman sat alone on a train platform in the middle of nowhere, her luggage beside her, her dignity in pieces, because the man who sent for her took one look at her face and walked away. A 35-year-old rancher watched his last calf die in frozen dirt and knew the bank would take everything he had left within weeks. Two strangers, two dead ends, one desperate decision made before sunrise. He asked her to marry him. She said yes. Not for love, not even for hope, just because neither of them had anywhere else to go. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay with me until the very end. The calf had been dead for maybe 2 hours by the time Mason Hale found it. It was lying on its side near the eastern fence line, half frozen already, its legs still bent at the angles of its final struggle. The snow around it had turned a dull rust color, and the tracks leading away from the body, wide-spaced, deep, told the story without any need for interpretation. Wolf. Probably two. They'd come through the gap in the fencing he hadn't gotten around to fixing because fixing things cost money, and money was the one resource the Hale Ranch had completely run out of. Mason crouched down beside the calf for a moment. He didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. He pulled off his glove, pressed 2 fingers against the animal's neck out of habit rather than hope, and then stood back up and looked at the gray Wyoming sky like it might offer him something useful. It didn't. It never did anymore. "That's the 3rd one this month," said a voice behind him. Elias Boone was standing maybe 20 feet back, his collar turned up against the wind, his hat pulled low. He was 61 years old, built like a fence post that had survived too many seasons, and he had the particular expression of a man who had run out of ways to soften bad news. "I know it's the 3rd one," Mason said. "Bank's gonna hear about it." "I know that too." Elias walked forward and looked down at the calf. He let out a long breath through his nose that turned to steam in the cold. "Fence on the east side's been open since Tuesday, I told you. I heard you the first time, Elias." A silence stretched between them, carried on the wind. Elias had been working this land since before Mason's father died and left the whole mess to a 22-year-old who didn't know half of what he thought he knew. He'd stayed through the drought years, through the bad seasons, through the funeral 2 Februaries ago when they'd buried Clara Hale in the frozen ground, and Mason had stood at the graveside looking like a man who'd already decided to follow her. He hadn't followed her, but there were days Mason suspected Elias wasn't entirely sure about that. "I'll patch the fence line today," Mason said finally. "With what? Wire's been—" "With whatever I can find. I'll figure it out." Elias nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but decided against it. That was one of the few things Mason genuinely appreciated about the man. He knew when to stop talking. Mason pulled his glove back on and turned away from the dead calf. He'd deal with the body later. Right now, he had 17 other animals to check on, a water trough that kept freezing over before sunrise, and a stack of papers on the kitchen table from the First National Bank of Cheyenne that he'd been turning face down every morning for 3 weeks because reading them twice hadn't made them any less catastrophic the first time. The Hale Ranch sat on 412 acres of northeastern Wyoming grassland that had once been considered some of the finest cattle country in the territory. Mason's grandfather had broken the ground. His father had expanded it, built the main house, sunk 3 wells, and run a herd of over 200 head at the operation's peak. People in Red Hollow used to talk about the Hale Ranch the way people talk about something permanent, something that would just always be there. That was before the drought, before the debt, before Clara. Now the fences sagged. The barn roof had a soft spot over the eastern stall that Mason kept telling himself he'd repair before the next heavy snowfall, and kept not repairing. The main house was clean enough. Mason was stubborn about that, didn't know exactly why, maybe because Clara had kept it spotless, and it felt wrong to let it go. But the wallpaper in the back bedroom had started peeling in September, and the kitchen window had a crack running through the lower pane that let in a needle of cold air on windy nights. From the outside, the place looked like a man who'd given up on himself but hadn't quite gotten around to lying down yet. Mason checked the remaining cattle, found 2 more that looked thin and rough around the edges, mentally added them to a list of problems he had no immediate solution for, and walked back to the house just as the wind picked up from the northwest. He stamped the snow off his boots on the porch and went inside. The papers were still on the table, face down where he'd left them. He sat down, turned them over, and read them again for what felt like the 100th time. The The language was formal and colorless, the way bank language always was, but the meaning underneath it was as plain as a slap. The outstanding balance on the ranch mortgage was $4,322. The bank had extended twice already, once on account of the drought and once on account of Clara's death, because even bankers had limits to how ruthless they were willing to look. But the letter, this most recent one, signed by a man named Gerald Pruitt, who Mason had met exactly once and disliked immediately, made it clear that no further extensions would be granted. 60 days. Actually fewer than that now, maybe 45 if he counted carefully. He set the papers down and looked at the kitchen wall. Clara had hung a small framed piece of embroidery there the first year they were married. Just a simple border pattern, nothing fancy, the kind of thing women made in the evenings when the day's work was done. He'd never taken it down. It seemed wrong to take it down. "You got any ideas?" he said to the empty kitchen. The embroidery didn't answer. The wind pushed through the crack in the window pane. Outside, something in the barn knocked against its stall door. Mason got up, put the coffee on, and started thinking about Red Hollow. The town of Red Hollow sat 12 miles southeast of the ranch, tucked against a low ridge that broke the worst of the northern wind. It wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a bank branch, a post office, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a church nobody attended as religiously as the pastor hoped, and a railroad depot that served the line running between Cheyenne and Billings. Mason rode in on a Thursday morning, which was as good a day as any for unpleasant business. His plan, if it could be called that, was to arrange the sale of his remaining cattle to Hartwell's, the livestock buyer who operated out of a low building near the depot. He'd been putting this off for weeks, the same way he'd been putting off reading the bank letters and fixing the east fence and accepting that the ranch was finished. But putting things off only worked for so long, and eventually reality had a way of sitting down across from you and refusing to leave until you paid attention to it. He tied his horse outside the general store and walked down the main street with his hands in his coat pockets. The cold had eased slightly from the morning's worst, but the sky was still the color of old pewter, low and heavy, the kind of sky that made you feel like something was pressing down on everything. He was passing the depot when he saw her. She was sitting on a bench on the far end of the platform, beside a large trunk that looked like it had been packed with more hope than had turned out to be warranted. She was wearing a dark traveling coat, city-made, the kind of coat that looked out of place against a Wyoming winter, the same way a ballroom gown would look out of place in a cattle pen. Her back was straight, very straight, the kind of posture that took effort, and she was staring at the middle distance with an expression that was working very hard at being composed and not quite getting all the way there. She was alone. That was the thing that caught Mason's attention first, even before he registered anything else about her. Not the coat or the trunk or the unfamiliarity of her face. The aloneness. It had a specific quality to it that Mason recognized, because he'd been wearing it himself for almost 2 years. He almost kept walking. He had enough of his own problems without collecting other people's. He kept walking for about 4 steps and then stopped. There was a small group of women from town. He recognized Dora Pratt, who ran the seamstress shop, and 2 others whose names he didn't know, standing near the depot entrance, watching the woman on the bench with the particular focused attention of people witnessing something they found entertaining. One of them said something quiet, and the others laughed. Mason turned around and walked to the platform. Up close, the woman looked somewhere in her early 40s. She had brown hair with some gray starting at the temples, dark eyes, a face that suggested she'd once been the kind of person who smiled often and had recently stopped. There were no obvious signs of tears, no dramatic distress, just that hard, careful stillness of someone who had made a decision not to fall apart in public and was holding to it through sheer determination. Her hands were folded in her lap. He noticed they weren't entirely steady. "Ma'am," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes assessed him quickly, the way he'd seen women do when they were trying to determine in about 3 seconds whether a man was worth being afraid of. Whatever she decided, her expression didn't change much. "I don't need assistance," she said. Her accent was Eastern. "Boston, maybe, or close enough." "I wasn't offering any," Mason said. That surprised her slightly. He could see it. "I was just going to ask if you were waiting on the next train north," he said, "because it doesn't come through until Saturday." A pause. Something moved behind her eyes. "I'm aware of the schedule." "All right." Mason said. He didn't leave, which he recognized was probably rude. He wasn't entirely sure why he was still standing there. She looked at him again. A longer look this time, less assessment, and more something else he couldn't name. Are you the welcoming committee? No. The sheriff? No. Then why are you still standing there? Mason thought about that. I'm not sure, he said honestly. I saw those women laughing at you and I didn't like it. That's mostly it. She stared at him for a long moment. Then something in the rigidity of her posture shifted, barely perceptible, like a single joint unlocking in a very tightly wound mechanism. Vivian Mercer, she said. Mason Hale. She didn't extend her hand and neither did he. That wasn't really a platform bench kind of exchange. You're from the East, he said. Boston. A pause. I came west I had an arrangement. She stopped, chose different words. It didn't work out. Mason understood, or thought he did. Mail order arrangements were common enough out here. He'd heard of them going wrong in various ways. He glanced in the direction where the groom, whoever he was, should theoretically have been and wasn't. His family objected, she said, following his glance. Her voice was flat and controlled, but the control cost her something. Apparently, I'm not what they expected. She said it the way people say things they've already said to themselves many times in private, trying to make them smaller by repetition, not quite succeeding. I'm 42 years old and I've been teaching school for 20 years, which apparently makes me too old and too independent for their purposes. Their purposes, Mason said. A ranch wife who would do what she was told. She looked out at the main street. I was under the impression I was coming west to be a partner to someone, not a piece of furniture. Mason didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't sound hollow. I have enough money for a train ticket back to Cheyenne, she continued. From there, I'm not entirely certain. My position in Boston was filled when I left. A small, tight pause. So that's my situation. I'm not sure why I'm telling you. I don't generally unburden myself to strangers on train platforms. I don't generally talk to strangers on train platforms either, Mason said. So we're even. She looked at him again, and this time the look had something almost like curiosity in it. You said your name was Hale. Is that the ranch outside town? The one people... She stopped. The one people say is going under, Mason finished. Yeah, that's mine. I heard some talk in town this morning. She said it carefully, without judgment, but without softening it either. I wasn't going to mention it. Most people have the sense not to, he said. Another silence. A freight wagon rolled past on the main street, its wheels cutting tracks in the frozen mud. The group of women near the depot entrance had dispersed, their entertainment apparently over. Mason looked at this woman on a bench with her careful posture and her one-way ticket to Cheyenne and her 20 years of teaching school, and something moved in his head that he didn't have a good name for. Not attraction, or not only that. Something more like recognition. The particular recognition of one person looking at another and seeing the outline of a familiar shape. Where are you staying tonight? He asked. The Saloon Hotel. It's what I can afford. The food there is terrible. I've already eaten, she said. I'm trying not to spend more than I have to until I figure out. She stopped again, looked away. I'll be fine. It was such an obvious lie, delivered with such genuine effort that Mason felt something pull in his chest. He knew that particular kind of lying. He'd been doing it himself for 2 years. There's a restaurant 2 doors down from the hotel, he said. Maggie Cotter runs it. The food is also terrible, but it's hot and the coffee is strong and she doesn't charge much. He paused. I need to eat before I head back to the ranch. I don't usually eat with company. She looked at him very steadily. Is this the part where you tell me you're harmless? I'm probably not harmless, Mason said. But I'm also not going to bother you. I'm too tired. Something crossed her face that might, in better circumstances, have been close to a smile. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in 3 days, she said. Maggie Cotter's restaurant was exactly as Mason described. Small, warm, not particularly clean, with 4 wooden tables and a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed in at least 5 years. Maggie herself was a large-framed woman in her 50s who ran the place with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped pretending service was something other than a transaction a long time ago. She brought coffee without being asked and food shortly after, and she didn't linger or chit-chat, which Mason had always appreciated. He and Vivian sat across from each other in the corner table, which was furthest from the draft near the door, and they talked. Not easily, at first. There were long pauses and careful word choices, and the general awkwardness of two people who didn't know each other and had no particular reason to pretend they did. But the coffee was hot, and the cold outside made the restaurant feel warmer than it actually was. And somewhere in the first half hour, the conversation stopped being careful and started being something else. He told her about the ranch, about the debt and the drought, and the bank's 60-day deadline. Though he left out Clara at first, the way you leave out the wound that's still too raw to press on. He told her about the cattle losses and the east fence and the letter from Gerald Pruitt at First National. "How many cattle do you have left?" she asked. 31, he said. "After today's loss." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "And the sale price per head in the current market?" He looked at her. "You know cattle prices?" "I don't, but I know how to think about a problem." She met his eyes. "How much?" $12, maybe $13 a head, if I'm lucky. Hartwell drives a hard bargain this time of year. She did the arithmetic quickly in her head. "That's under $400 total, less than a tenth of what you owe." "I know." "So selling the cattle doesn't save the ranch." "I know that too." She nodded slowly, not with the satisfaction of someone who'd found a flaw, but with the focus of someone mapping a landscape. "What else do you have?" Mason spread his hand slightly. "Land. The buildings on it, a barn, a storage shed, the main house. Elias, who works for me and probably shouldn't at this point because I can barely pay him." He paused. "That's about the full inventory." "How big is the storage shed?" He frowned. "What do you mean, how big is it? It's a storage shed. Approximately 30 feet long? 40? 35 maybe. Why?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then she looked up at him. "How far is the nearest school from your ranch?" "Nearest school is in Red Hollow, 12 miles. There's no school north or east of that for another 20 miles. He paused. How many homesteads between here and the northern boundary of your land?" "I don't know exactly. A dozen, maybe more. Settlers have been coming in the last few years." "With children?" He thought about it. He'd seen children on a few of the homesteads he'd passed. Never really counted them. "Some," he said. "More than some, probably," she said. "Frontier families tend to be large." She was quiet again, and he could see her working something out behind her eyes, the way a person does when they're not sure yet if what they're thinking is possible or ridiculous. "A school," she said finally. "Not the town school. You're too far for that. A school on your land. The storage shed could be converted. It doesn't need much. A stove, some benches, light." Mason stared at her. "You want to turn my storage shed into a school?" "I want to teach," she said plainly. "I need to earn money. You have a building not being used and families within riding distance who have children without access to education. The territory pays per-student grants to operating frontier schools. It's not a lot, but it's consistent income." She paused. "And if your ranch has a functioning school on it, it's more than just a failing cattle operation in the bank's ledger. It's a community asset. That changes the conversation with Mr. Pruitt." Mason looked at her for a long time. "You came up with all that just now?" he said. "I was thinking on the platform," she said. "I had several hours." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, put it back down. "You know what you're describing requires you to stay on a ranch that's on the edge of collapse, in a Wyoming winter, with a man you met 2 hours ago." "I'm aware of that." "And you're—" He stopped, tried to find a diplomatic way to phrase it, and gave up. "You don't know anything about ranch life." "I know nothing about ranch life," she agreed without particular embarrassment. "But I know how to teach, I know how to manage accounts, and I know how to work hard enough that people don't have a reason to complain about me." A small pause. "And I have nowhere to go." That last part landed in the silence between them with a kind of thud. "I have nowhere to go either," Mason said. "So at least we're starting from the same place." He didn't ask her that night. He thought about it on the ride back to the ranch, the wind cutting across the open country and the moon lost behind clouds. Elias's old spotted gelding plodding along with the reliable indifference of an animal that had long ago stopped having opinions about where it was going. He thought about what it would mean, the practicalities of it, The legal arrangement, the living situation, what the town would say, what Elias would say, what he himself would think in 6 months when the immediate desperation had either resolved or gotten worse, and there was a woman he barely knew living in his house. He thought about Clara. Not in a guilty way exactly, though the guilt was there too, like background noise he'd stopped noticing because it never went away. More in the way of, she would have had an opinion about this. Clara had opinions about everything. She'd have told him in that direct, impatient way of hers that he was being an idiot or that he wasn't being as big an idiot as she'd initially thought, depending on which way she came down on it. And he realized, sitting there on horseback in the dark, that he genuinely didn't know which way she'd call it. That uncertainty felt like the first honest thing he'd felt in a while. He got back to the ranch at 9, fed the horses, checked on the cattle one more time out of habit, and went inside. Elias was already asleep. The old man kept early hours and didn't apologize for it. The kitchen was cold because Mason had been gone most of the day and the stove had burned down. He built it back up with the last of the wood from the back porch pile and stood there watching the fire catch. The letters from the bank were still on the table. The embroidery was still on the wall. He went to bed and lay on his back in the dark and thought about a woman sitting on a train platform with her spine so straight it looked like defiance and her hands that weren't quite steady. He went to sleep thinking about it and woke up at 4 in the morning still thinking about it, and by 6 he had made his decision. He was back at Maggie's restaurant by 8 o'clock. Vivian was there. He'd been fairly sure she would be, since the saloon hotel didn't serve breakfast and the restaurant was the only other option for a woman on a limited budget who needed to eat. She was sitting at the same corner table with coffee and something that might generously be called scrambled eggs, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of someone who had also been awake most of the night, thinking hard about something. "You came back," she said. "I had a thought," he said. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was rude, but also, he figured, probably not worse than what he was about to propose. Maggie appeared from the kitchen, and he held up one finger, and she disappeared again. "What kind of thought?" Vivian asked. He looked at the table for a second, then looked up at her directly. "I need a wife more than I need a cattle sale, and you need a situation more than you need a train ticket to Cheyenne, so I'm asking if you'd be willing to get married." The silence that followed was one of the longer silences Mason had sat through in his life, which was saying something, because he'd spent a lot of time in the company of silence. Vivian set her coffee cup down very carefully. "You're serious." "I'm completely serious. You barely know me. I know that you're practical and you don't panic easily, and you thought up a better plan for my ranch in an evening than I have in 2 years," he said. I'm not saying this is... It wouldn't be..." He stopped, started over, because the thing he needed to say deserved better than stumbling. "It's not a romantic proposal. I want you to understand that. I'm not saying I'd fall in love with you next week. I don't know what I'd feel. But I know I need someone who can help hold this place together, and I think you need somewhere to land, and this could work as a practical arrangement between two people who are honest about what it is." She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "What would it mean?" she asked. "Practically. Walk me through it." "You'd live in the house. There's a spare bedroom. You'd have your own space. You'd run the school from the storage shed when we convert it. You'd help with the accounts, which are a disaster. I'd handle the cattle and the land." He paused. "I wouldn't ask anything of you beyond what's practical. I'm not trying to buy a... You wouldn't be treated like..." "Like furniture," she said. "Like furniture," he confirmed. She looked out the restaurant window at the main street of Red Hollow, where the morning was beginning in the slow, cold way of frontier mornings. A horse tethered here, a shop door opening there, a man in a heavy coat arguing with the wind about which direction it was allowed to blow. "My condition," she said, "is honesty. If you're struggling, I need to know. If the ranch is worse than you're telling me, I need to know. If you're angry or grieving or..." She paused. "I'm coming in as a partner, not as someone to be managed." She turned back to look at him. "Can you agree to that?" "Yes," Mason said. "One more thing." She met his eyes very steadily. "You lost someone. I can see it on you. I'm not asking about it, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't there, but I need to know that you're not marrying me as a substitution for that." The directness of it hit him somewhere uncomfortable, which probably meant it was accurate. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said honestly. I know I'm desperate, and I know I'm not thinking the way I was thinking 2 years ago. But I can promise you, I'm not asking you to be someone else." She studied him for a long time. Long enough that Maggie came out of the kitchen with his coffee, looked between them, and quietly retreated without a word. "All right," Vivian said. "Yes," Mason nodded. "There's a courthouse 2 streets over. Judge Harmon does the paperwork." "Today?" she said, and something in her voice was caught between alarm and something that might have been steadiness. "Unless you'd rather wait," he said. She looked at her trunk, which was visible through the restaurant window, still sitting on the platform. Then she looked back at him. "No," she said. "Today is fine." The courthouse wedding lasted 14 minutes. Judge Harmon was a large man with a gray beard and the permanent expression of someone who had seen too much of human decision-making to be surprised by any of it. He read the words from the civil register, asked the required questions, got the required answers, and signed the document in a hand so practiced it took him about 4 seconds. His clerk witnessed it. There were no rings, there were no flowers. Mason said the words, and Vivian said the words, and it was done. They walked back out into the cold Wyoming morning as husband and wife in the technical and legal sense of the phrase, which was the only sense either of them was prepared to claim right now. "That's that," Vivian said. "Yeah," Mason said. They stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, the wind moving between them, neither of them quite certain what the next gesture was supposed to be. "I need to go collect my trunk from the platform," she said finally. "I'll bring the wagon around," he said. And that was how they began. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours, which was long enough for the morning's decision to settle from the adrenaline of action into the harder reality of consequences. Vivian sat beside Mason on the wagon bench with her trunk in the back and her hands in her coat pockets, and watched the landscape change from the scattered buildings of Red Hollow to open, snow-covered grassland that seemed to go on without interruption until it hit the edge of the sky. She had lived in Boston for 42 years. She had been in Wyoming for 4 days. This was, by any reasonable measure, the most impulsive decision she had ever made, and Vivian Mercer was not an impulsive person. She had been sensible her entire life. She had been sensible about her education, sensible about her career, sensible about the original arrangement that had brought her west, had done research, asked questions, corresponded for 6 months before agreeing to come. Sensible had not, in the end, saved her from sitting alone on a train platform while a town full of strangers laughed. She watched the horizon and thought, well then. Mason drove without talking, which she was beginning to understand was simply his natural mode of being, not rudeness. He had the particular stillness of a man who had spent years working outdoors alone, the kind of stillness that had long stopped requiring noise to fill it. "Who else lives on the ranch?" she asked. "Elias Boone," Mason said. "He's been there 20 years. He has a room in the bunkhouse." A pause. "He's going to have opinions about this." "About the marriage?" "About everything, probably. That's generally his way." Another pause. "He's not mean-spirited. He just doesn't soften things much." "I'll manage," she said. Mason glanced at her. "I believe you," he said. And it didn't sound like pleasantry. It sounded like he meant it. The ranch came into view from the top of a low rise, and Vivian looked at it and did not say anything. She had been warned it was in rough shape. She had mentally prepared herself for rough. But there was rough, and then there was the particular look of a place that had been winning a fight with entropy for years and was recently starting to lose it. The fence posts along the main approach leaned in irregular directions that suggested they'd stop trying to hold the line. The barn roof had a visible sag toward one corner. The main house itself was solid enough in its bones, but the bones were showing. Peeling paint, a porch board that clearly gave too much underfoot, shutters on the upper windows that had blown crooked and never been straightened. But the windows were clean. She noticed that. Clean windows in a place this weathered meant someone still cared. She held on to that. Elias Boone came out of the barn when they pulled up, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at Vivian with an expression that went through about 4 distinct phases in roughly 2 seconds. Surprise was the first one, then something that looked like evaluation, then a flat, careful neutrality that she suspected was his version of keeping his mouth shut. "Elias," Mason said, getting down from the wagon, "this is Vivian. She's my wife." Elias looked at Mason for a long moment. Then he looked at Vivian again. Then he said, When that happened? This morning, Mason said. Uh-huh, said Elias. That was all he said. He went back inside the barn. Vivian watched the barn door close. You said he has opinions, she said. That was him not having them out loud, Mason said. Give it until dinner. The house inside was better and worse than she'd expected in different ways. Better, it was clean. Not just survivably clean, but genuinely clean, which told her something about Mason that he hadn't said directly. Someone who was truly defeated didn't scrub his kitchen floor and keep his windows free of grime. Whatever was broken in him, some part of it was still fighting. Worse, it was cold in a way that went deeper than the temperature. Not the cold of an unheated building. There was a fire going in the kitchen stove, small but present. But the cold of a house that had been without domestic life for too long. No smells of cooking that had happened recently. No small clutter of everyday living. Just a man's bare management of a space, functional and joyless. The spare bedroom was at the back of the house. It had a bed with a reasonable mattress, a washstand, a small window that looked out at the north field. Nothing on the walls. The floor was clean. There was a hook on the back of the door. It's not much, Mason said from the doorway. It's more than a train platform, she said. Where do you want me to put my trunk? He carried it in for her and set it against the wall without being asked, which she noted. Dinner's usually whatever I can put together around 6, he said. I'm not much of a cook. I'll cook, she said. He looked slightly surprised, then nodded. There's supplies in the pantry. Not a lot. A pause. There's bread, beans, some potatoes, salt pork. That's enough for a meal, she said. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, as if he'd expected the conversation to require more navigation than it did. I'll be outside, he said. Fence to fix. She looked at him. East side? He blinked. How do you know about the east fence? You mentioned 3 cattle losses. I assumed the problem was ongoing. She paused. Take Elias with you if you can. 2 people fix fence faster than 1. Mason looked at her for a second with that expression she was already starting to recognize, the one he got when something surprised him, and he wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or not. Then he said, Yeah, and left. She stood in the quiet of her new room and put both hands flat on top of her trunk and breathed. Outside, she heard the low exchange of Mason's voice, and then Elias's, and then the sound of boots moving toward the eastern field. She let herself have 60 seconds of being overwhelmed by the entirety of it. The decision and the courthouse and the cold bedroom and the 42 years that had somehow brought her to this specific and improbable place. She had learned, over the course of a life that had not always been easy, that there was value in letting yourself feel how hard something was, as long as you put a time limit on it, 60 seconds. Then she opened her trunk, found her apron, and went to see what she could do with salt pork and potatoes. Dinner was plain but hot, which in Mason's experience was about the best you could say about most things that mattered. They sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, because Elias ate in the house on cold evenings, which was apparently a long-standing arrangement and one that nobody had changed just because the domestic situation had shifted dramatically since morning. Elias sat at his usual end and ate with the methodical efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped expecting meals to be anything other than fuel. Vivian ate with the careful composure of someone who was aware she was being evaluated and was not going to give the evaluator anything to work with. For a while, nobody said anything. The fire in the stove ticked. Wind moved against the kitchen window. You from back east, Elias said finally. It wasn't quite a question. Boston, Vivian said. Never been to Boston. There's not much reason to go unless you already lived there. Elias considered this. You know anything about cattle? Nothing, she said. Horses? A little. Enough to ride. Winters out here? Not yet. He pointed his fork vaguely in her direction, not unkindly. It gets bad. Worse than you think bad is. I've been told, she said. Being told isn't the same as knowing. He returned to his food. You'll learn. I expect I will, she said. Elias looked at Mason. Something passed between them that Vivian couldn't fully read. Something quick, and waited. Mason looked back at his food without expression. School idea, Elias said. Whose was that? Mine, Vivian said. Might work, he said, which, Vivian was beginning to gather, was the highest form of approval in Elias Boone's repertoire. After dinner, Vivian washed the dishes because there was no sensible reason not to. Mason dried them without being asked. They stood at the kitchen basin side by side in near silence, the domesticity of it so new and strange that it sat somewhere between comfortable and surreal, and neither of them commented on it. When it was done, Mason said goodnight and went to his room. Vivian sat at the kitchen table for a while with the lamp turned low and the ledger book she'd asked Mason about, and he'd produced from a drawer with visible reluctance. She opened the first one and looked at the accounts, and felt the particular cold clarity that numbers gave her. All emotion stripped out, just the shape of a problem presented in ink on paper. The shape of this problem was bad, worse than Mason had said, maybe, or worse than he'd admitted to himself. The expenditures were inconsistently tracked, several entries were duplicated, and the income column hadn't been reliably updated in almost 8 months. She worked through it slowly, column by column, making small marks in the margins, and after an hour she had a clearer picture of the damage. They were not as far gone as she'd feared. They were close, but not quite. There was a path through, if the school worked and if Mason could hold the cattle through to spring, and if nothing else went wrong in the meantime, which was the kind of conditional that could topple everything. She closed the ledger and looked at the embroidery on the wall, the small framed piece with the simple pattern, clearly handmade, clearly old, clearly put there by someone who was no longer here to look at it. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't the time for that. She turned down the lamp and went to bed in the spare room and lay listening to the sound of Wyoming wind against the walls of a house that was not hers and not hers, in a life that had, in the space of 24 hours, become entirely unrecognizable. She was terrified. She was also, under the terror, something that took her a moment to identify. Present. She was present in a way she hadn't been in months, maybe longer, like something had been turned back on. She pulled the blanket to her chin and told herself that was enough for one day. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls, testing them. They held. The first week was an education in discomfort for everyone involved. Vivian had known, going in, that adjusting to ranch life would be hard. She had told herself this repeatedly on the wagon ride out, and again in the spare bedroom that first night, and again the next morning when she woke before dawn to the sound of Mason moving through the kitchen in the dark, pulling on his coat and boots before she'd fully understood where she was. What she hadn't fully accounted for was the specific texture of hard, not dramatic, not crisis level, just the relentless accumulation of small things she didn't know how to do yet, in a place that didn't have time to wait for her to figure them out. The cook stove ran hotter than she expected, and she burned the first 2 breakfasts before she understood its particular temperament. The water pump on the back porch froze each night and had to be thawed each morning with a kettle of hot water poured slowly over the handle, a process that nobody had told her about, and that she discovered on her own through the specific humiliation of standing at a pump for 10 minutes, wondering why it wasn't working while Mason watched from the doorway with an expression carefully arranged into neutrality. He didn't laugh. She was aware he wanted to. "You could have told me about the pump," she said. "I thought it was obvious," he said. "A pump that freezes every night is not obvious to someone who has never encountered a pump that freezes every night." "Fair point," he said, and went to get his coat. She got better at the pump. She got better at the stove. She cataloged the things she didn't know and worked at them methodically, the same way she'd always approached problems she couldn't yet solve. Break it down. Practice the components. Don't let the gap between where you are and where you need to be make you feel so bad about yourself that you stop moving forward. It was the same advice she'd given children in classrooms for 20 years. It worked approximately as well for adults. The harder adjustments were less practical. Living inside someone else's grief was different from understanding that they were grieving. Mason moved through the house with a particular care around the things that had belonged to Clara. The embroidery on the wall, a blue ceramic pitcher on the kitchen shelf, a worn Bible on the side table that he never opened but never moved. That made Vivian conscious every day of the space she was occupying that had once belonged to someone else. She didn't resent it, but she navigated it carefully, the way you navigate a room in the dark, hands slightly out to avoid collisions. He never talked about Clara directly, but occasionally he'd say something like, "Clara used to," and then stop, catching himself, as if he'd walked through a door he hadn't meant to open and was now backing out of it. Vivian would acknowledge it with a small nod and move on, and he seemed to appreciate that she didn't push. She was learning the geography of him, the places you could walk and the places you couldn't, at least not yet. Elias watched all of this with the calibrated attention of a man who had known Mason Hale for 20 years and was taking his time deciding what to think about the new development. He wasn't unfriendly to Vivian, but he wasn't warm either. He occupied a careful middle ground of professional civility that could theoretically become either one, depending on how things developed. He helped her carry firewood the second morning without being asked, then spent the rest of the day pointedly not acknowledging that he'd done it. The ledger situation she'd diagnosed the first night turned out to be even worse in daylight. She spread the books across the kitchen table on the third morning after the breakfast dishes were cleared and went through them properly, column by column, making notes on a separate sheet of paper. Mason sat across from her initially, watching with the expression of a man at a doctor's appointment who suspects the news is going to be bad and is oscillating between wanting to know and not wanting to know. "You can go do other things," she said. "I'll come find you when I have the full picture." "I should probably be here for this." "You're making it harder to concentrate." He left. She heard him in the barn for the next 2 hours, doing something with a repetitive hammering quality that suggested he was fixing something that needed fixing and also working out frustration in the process. When she had the full picture, she went to find him. He was in the barn repairing the stall door that had been coming loose from its upper hinge. He looked at her face when she came in and set down his hammer. "That bad?" "The accounts are inconsistent, not catastrophic," she said. "Several expenses have been recorded twice. I think it was honest error. You were probably entering things when you were tired and lost track. Once I correct those, the actual outstanding balance to the bank is $4,011, not $4,300. Mason stared at her. "You found $300 in errors?" "About that, yes. In one morning. The records weren't organized, they just needed organizing." She looked at the paper in her hand. "The other issue is the cattle feed costs. You've been buying from Hartwell's, which is, he's the only buyer close enough. He's charging you 40% above the Cheyenne market rate for feed grain," she said. "I checked the last supply invoice. If you buy direct from the grain cooperative in Red Hollow and store it yourself, you save considerably over the course of a season." Mason was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man being shown something he wished he'd seen himself but couldn't quite bring himself to resent being shown. "How do you know the Cheyenne market rate?" "I asked Maggie Cotter for the most recent issue of the Cheyenne Tribune when we passed through town," she said. "Commodity prices are on the third page." He picked up his hammer again, not to use it, just to have something in his hand. "Anything else?" "Yes," she said. "The school. She'd been working on it since the first day. Not the building itself, that required materials and labor and would take some time, but the groundwork." She'd spent the second afternoon riding with Mason to the 3 nearest homesteads under the pretext of introductions, and while Mason talked to the men about fencing and cattle and the general state of the range, Vivian had talked to the women, or tried to. The reception had been cautious at best. The McAllister homestead, 4 miles northeast, had 3 children between 5 and 12, and Mrs. McAllister had looked at Vivian with the specific wariness of a frontier woman evaluating an outsider who wanted something from her. She hadn't been rude, but she'd been non-committal in the practiced way of someone who'd been disappointed before and had learned to keep her distance from promises. "A school on the Hale place," she'd said, as if testing the weight of the words. "That's something." "It would be," Vivian had agreed. "Long way to ride every morning." 4 miles with children is manageable in most weather. I'd arrange the hours around the worst of it." Mrs. McAllister had looked at her with eyes that were older than her face. "You're the Eastern woman," she'd said. "Not cruelly, just specifically. The one from the train." "Yes," Vivian had said, and let it sit there without defending it. "Heard you married Mason Hale the same day you arrived." "I did." "Why?" Vivian had considered several answers and chosen the honest one. "Because we both needed something the other person had. It seemed sensible." That had gotten a pause, and then a very slight, private smile from Mrs. McAllister. "I married my husband after knowing him 11 days, she'd said, "so I'm not going to throw stones." She'd looked at her children, playing in the snow near the fence. "I'll think about it." The Svensson homestead had gone similarly, polite doubt that left a narrow opening. The Beaumont family, 6 miles out, hadn't been home. "It's going to take time," Vivian told Mason in the barn. They don't trust outsiders, and they have no reason to yet. No, he agreed. The school will work, but not quickly. She folded the notes and put them in her coat pocket. The immediate problem is still the bank payment in how many days now? 38, he said. He'd clearly been counting. Then we need to talk to Gerald Pruitt. Mason's jaw moved in a way that suggested his feelings about Gerald Pruitt were not warm. I've talked to Pruitt. It hasn't helped. You talked to him before, she said. As a single debtor with no plan. We'd be talking to him now as a married couple with an operating school on the property and a corrected account balance. She looked at him steadily. I've negotiated with creditors before. A school is a community asset in the bank's ledger, too. It means the land has a function beyond cattle, which means it holds value differently than a failed ranch. Pruitt's job is to recover the bank's money. If he thinks foreclosure gives him less of it than a renegotiated schedule does, he'll listen. Mason looked at her for a long moment. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. My school in Boston was in a building owned by a trust that nearly went under in '89, she said. I negotiated a 3-year reduced rent arrangement that kept us operating. The principles are similar. He was quiet. Outside the barn, the wind pushed through the empty corrals with a low, hollow sound. All right, he said finally. We'll go see Pruitt. She nodded and turned to go. She'd gotten to the barn door when he said her name. Vivian. She stopped, looked back. Thank you, he said. For the ledger. It was plainly said without performance, and it landed differently because of that. Not gratitude for a favor, but something with more weight. Acknowledgement, maybe, that he'd been carrying something alone that didn't have to be carried alone anymore. That's what we agreed to, she said. I know, he said. Still. She went back to the house and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the north field, where the snow was undisturbed and flat and white, all the way to the tree line. And she thought that this was not the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She had been told, when her mother died, and when the teaching position she'd spent 10 years building had been given to a younger man because the board preferred younger men, and when the Boston arrangement had gone to pieces around her on a train platform in Wyoming, she had been told, by herself and others, that she was strong enough. She'd never entirely believed it when things were actively bad. She believed it slightly more now. She started a pot of beans for dinner and went to work on the school conversion plans. The storage shed took 3 weeks to become something that could reasonably be called a classroom, and those 3 weeks were among the most physically demanding of Vivian's life, which had not previously been physically demanding at all. She had not, prior to arriving at the Hale Ranch, ever driven a nail with any consistency. She had not sawed wood, she had not hauled gravel to level a floor that had a distinct tilt toward the south end. Mason showed her, with characteristic brevity, how to do each of these things, and she did them badly at first, and then less badly, and then adequately, and Elias, who initially observed the conversion project with the skepticism of a man who had seen many plans come and go, eventually picked up a hammer himself without anyone asking him to. That was the moment Vivian decided she and Elias Boone were going to be fine. You didn't have to do that, she told him, when he spent a full afternoon putting in the window frame she'd been struggling with for 2 days. Window wasn't straight, he said. It's straighter now, she agreed. He looked at his work with a critical squint. Still not perfectly level. Nothing out here is perfectly level, she said. It'll do. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't disagreement either, and went back to work. The trip to see Gerald Pruitt happened on a Wednesday, 2.5 weeks after Vivian arrived at the ranch. Pruitt was a compact man in his late 50s, with the look of someone who had organized his feelings into a filing system and kept the more inconvenient ones locked in a drawer marked Later. He sat behind a large desk in the Red Hollow branch office of First National and looked at Mason with the polite immovability of someone who had already rehearsed this meeting and knew how it ended. Then Vivian set her notes on the desk. Mr. Pruitt, she said, I'm Vivian Hale. I've been managing the ranch accounts for the past 3 weeks, and I'd like to walk you through a revised assessment of our situation. Pruitt looked at her notes, then at her, then at Mason, who was sitting with his hat on his knee and the expression of a man who had decided his best contribution to this meeting was to stay out of the way. Mrs. Hale, Pruitt said carefully, the outstanding balance, corrected for the recording errors in the original ledger, is $4,011, she said. The cattle sale this spring, conservative estimate, brings approximately $380. The school currently has confirmed interest from 4 families representing 7 children, with 2 more families considering. The territorial per-student grant is $9 annually per enrolled student, with additional funding available if enrollment exceeds 10. She turned a page in her notes. The school makes the land a mixed-use property rather than a failing single-use operation, which affects its assessed value and therefore the bank's collateral position. Pruitt was looking at her notes. I'm proposing a 12-month restructured payment schedule, she continued. Smaller monthly payments beginning in April, with a larger settlement at year's end when the school's first full grant payment comes through and the spring cattle sale is complete. She turned the notes to face him across the desk. The bank recovers its full amount. The timeline extends, but the certainty of recovery improves. The office was quiet. A clock somewhere in the building ticked with bureaucratic regularity. Pruitt looked at the notes for a long time. Then he looked up at Mason. Is this accurate? The enrollment figures? The school opens in 2 weeks, Mason said. Ask Mrs. McAllister out on the North Road if you want confirmation. Pruitt looked back at Vivian. He had the expression of a man who had expected to say no and was now doing arithmetic he hadn't planned to do. The recording errors in the ledger, he said. You verified these personally? Column by column, she said. I can show you the workings. He was quiet for another moment. Then he pulled a blank form from his drawer. I'll need to present this to the branch manager in Cheyenne, he said, but I think we can work with this framework. On the wagon ride back to the ranch, Mason was quiet for a long time. The sun was getting low and the snow on the open fields had turned gold at the edges, the kind of light that made Wyoming look like it was trying to apologize for being so hard the rest of the time. He would have foreclosed, Mason said. 3 weeks ago, if I'd walked in there alone, he'd have been very polite about it, but that would have been the end. Probably, Vivian said. You knew that. I thought it likely. He looked out at the road. I keep thinking I should have figured this out on my own. Why? She said. He didn't answer right away. Because it's my land, my problem. It's our land now, she said, and the word surprised her slightly as it came out, the easiness of it, the way it sat without awkwardness. And you did figure it out. You just needed someone to help you think. Mason was quiet for another long stretch of road. Then he said, Clara used to say I was stubborn to the point of stupidity when it came to asking for help. It was the first time he'd said her name to Vivian directly, not stopped himself before it, not redirected, just said it, like a door opening a crack. Vivian didn't make a thing of it. She was probably right, she said. That surprised a short, rough sound out of him that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. It was the first time she'd heard anything near it from him. Yeah, he said. She usually was. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was different from the silences that had come before. Not the silence of 2 strangers managing proximity, but something that had slightly more room in it. The ranch came into view against the darkening sky, the lamp already lit in the kitchen window where Elias had apparently gone in early out of the cold. The school opened on a Tuesday morning, 8 days later. 7 children arrived. Not the 3 or 4 that Vivian had considered a realistic minimum, but 7. The McAllister children, 2 of the Svensson boys, and 2 children from a homestead family named Garrett that she hadn't even visited, who'd apparently heard about it from someone else and made the decision to come without being asked. She stood at the shed door as they came in out of the cold, small figures in heavy coats, with the particular combination of shy and curious that children brought to new things, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for longer than she wanted to count. She looked back toward the house and saw Mason standing on the porch watching. He had his arms crossed and his hat pulled down against the morning wind, and she couldn't read his expression from that distance. But he was watching. She turned back to her students, pulled the shed door closed behind her against the cold, and began. The school had been open for 6 weeks when the sky turned the color that Elias said meant serious trouble. He came in from the east pasture on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the kitchen doorway with snow on his shoulders and that particular look on his face, not alarm exactly, because Elias Boone didn't do alarm, but a kind of focused gravity that Vivian had learned to read as his version of it. Storm coming, he said. Mason looked up from the harness he was mending at the kitchen table. How bad? Bad. Elias pulled off his gloves one finger at a time. Sky's got that green-gray to it north of the ridge. Wind's already backing around. I've seen 3 of these in 40 years out here, and none of them were anything you wanted to be outside in. Vivian was at the stove. She turned to look at him. How long before it hits? Tonight. Tomorrow morning at the latest. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. We need to bring the cattle into the south pasture, close as we can get them to the barn. Get the water troughs filled before they freeze solid. Stack as much wood on the back porch as we can move before dark. What followed was 3 hours of the hardest moving Vivian had done since she'd arrived at the ranch, which was saying something given the previous 6 weeks. She hauled firewood while Mason and Elias worked the cattle, an operation that was loud and cold and involved considerably more shouting than she'd expected, since cattle apparently had strong feelings about being moved in deteriorating weather and were not shy about expressing them. She filled every pot and basin in the kitchen with water. She checked the schoolhouse, pulled the stove damper halfway shut to keep embers from sparking unattended, and wedged the door with an extra board against the wind that was already starting to build from the northwest with an intent that felt personal. By the time dark came, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees from the afternoon. By midnight, it had dropped 15 more. Vivian lay in her room listening to the wind work itself into something that stopped sounding like weather and started sounding like something with a specific grievance against the house. The walls flexed slightly under gusts that hit with a physical concussion she could feel through the mattress. The window in her room rattled in its frame without stopping. She got up twice to check that the latch was secure, and both times found it was, and went back to bed and lay there listening. She was still awake at 2 in the morning when she heard Mason's door open and his boots on the kitchen floor, and a minute later the back door open and the sound of the storm briefly doubling in volume before the door closed again. She got up, put on 2 layers and her coat over that, and followed. The cold outside hit her with a physical force that she was still, even after 6 weeks, not fully prepared for. It wasn't just cold, it was consuming, the kind of cold that immediately began working on every uncovered inch of skin and kept working. The snow was coming nearly horizontal, the wind driving it so hard that the barn was invisible from the back porch even though it was 30 feet away. She could see Mason's lantern moving somewhere in the white, and she followed it, one hand over her face, until she reached the barn door and pushed inside. The relative stillness inside the barn after the storm outside was like stepping into another world. The animals were uneasy, shifting and making sounds that weren't quite their normal sounds, but the barn held. Mason was at the far end checking on a heifer that had been looking rough for 3 days. He turned when she came in, and even in the lantern light she could see the snow crusted on his coat and hat. "You should be inside," he said. "So should you," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was caught between annoyance and something that might have been relief at the company. He turned back to the heifer. "She's holding. For now." Vivian came and stood beside him and looked at the animal. It was lying down with a stillness that wasn't right. "Is she going to make it?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe." He put his hand flat on the heifer's side and held it there, feeling something Vivian didn't have enough knowledge yet to interpret. "She's breathing all right." They stood there for a while in the barn while the storm did what it was doing to everything outside, and the animals shifted and the lantern flame bent and straightened in the drafts that found their way through the walls. It was not comfortable. It was not warm. But there was something in it. The 2 of them standing in the dark with the storm outside and the animals needing watching, that had a quality of shared weight Vivian didn't have a precise word for. "Go back to the house," Mason said finally. "I'll stay out here for a while." "I'll stay too," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He didn't argue further. He moved a hay bale to the center of the aisle, and they sat on it with the lantern on the floor between them and the storm working at the barn walls with everything it had. And they sat there in the imperfect shelter of that place until about 4 in the morning when Mason decided the heifer was stable enough to leave, and they went back to the house through the dark and the howling white and didn't speak again until morning. The storm lasted 2.5 days. On the second day, with the snow too deep and the wind too violent to safely move between the barn and the house, they exhausted the wood on the back porch and started burning what was inside. The extra chairs first, then the stacked boards Mason had been saving to repair the porch steps. then a section of fencing he'd stored in the mudroom that winter. Vivian cooked whatever was available, which became less available as the second day went on. Beans, hardtack, the last of the potatoes, a thin soup from a bone she found at the back of the pantry. Elias ate without complaint and without comment, which she'd come to understand was his way of saying that things were bad, but they'd been bad before. On the morning of the third day, the wind dropped, not gradually. Abruptly, the way a door closing cuts off noise from another room. The silence that replaced it was so complete it felt strange, like the world holding its breath. Mason went out first. Vivian watched from the kitchen window as he walked out into the yard, which was now a landscape of drifts that had reshaped everything. The fence lines buried, the south pasture indistinguishable from the north, the storage shed and schoolhouse visible only as a low white mound that suggested a structure somewhere underneath. Mason walked to the edge of the yard and stopped. She couldn't see his face from this angle, but she could see the set of his shoulders, and the set of his shoulders told her before he came back inside. She put on her coat and followed him out to the south pasture. The cattle were in the snow. Some of them were still standing. Most of them weren't. She stood beside Mason and looked at it and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the scene wasn't already saying for itself. The ones that hadn't made it had gone down during the worst of the second night, probably, when the temperature had gone to places that no living thing was built to endure without shelter. And the shelter hadn't been enough. 17 animals. She counted without wanting to count. Mason stood very still. His hands were at his sides. "Mason," she said. He didn't answer. "Mason." She moved to stand in front of him, which required stepping in snow up to her knees, and looked at his face. His jaw was set in the way she recognized now as the external architecture of something going wrong inside him. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance and had a quality she'd seen only once before, at the courthouse, the morning they married, for just a second before he'd recomposed himself. The quality of a man standing at the edge of something. "Come inside," she said. "There's no point," he said. His voice was flat in a way that was worse than if it had been broken. "There is genuinely no point, Vivian. You understand that? We needed those animals. Without them, we can't make the first payment in April, which means the restructured agreement with Pruitt falls through, which means—" "I know what it means," she said. "Then you know there's no—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, looked away from her at the far tree line, at the flat white nothing of the plains in every direction. "I can't fix this one. There's no ledger error to find. There's no bank negotiation. The animals are dead and the money they represented is dead with them, and I don't—" He stopped again. His breath came out in a long plume of steam. "I don't know how to tell you to go to Cheyenne and get on a train east, but I think that might be what I'm telling you." The words landed in the cold air between them. Vivian stood in the snow up to her knees and looked at this man. This stubborn, grieving, difficult, decent man who had offered her a desperate bargain on a train platform and had never once, in the 6 weeks since, treated her as anything less than a person. And she felt something solidify in her that she hadn't known was liquid. "No," she said. He looked at her. "Vivian, no." She said it without anger, but without any give in it. "You pulled me off a platform when I had nowhere to go. You gave me a room and a problem to solve, and you kept your word about every single thing you said you'd do. I'm not leaving because 17 cattle died in a blizzard." She took a step toward him through the snow. "And I need you to stop standing there adding up reasons it's over, because I'm not done." He stared at her. The wind moved between them, lighter now, the afterbreath of the storm. "You're not done," he repeated. "I'm not done," she said. "Now come inside. I need to think, and I can't do it standing in a field." He came inside. Elias was at the kitchen table with coffee he'd made while they were outside, and he looked at both of them when they came in with the sharp attention of a man who could read a situation from the way people moved through a door. He poured 2 more cups without comment and set them on the table. Vivian took her coat off and sat down and put both hands around the cup and thought. The school had 9 students now. 2 more families had sent children in the month since it opened, word having traveled the way word traveled in isolated country. Slowly at first. Then in a rush, once enough people decided something was worth trusting. 9 students at $9 per year in territorial grants was $81, which was not nothing but was also not a mortgage payment. The spring cattle sale, even reduced to the surviving animals, Would bring perhaps $150 if she pushed Hartwell harder than Mason had previously pushed him. She needed to think bigger than the existing pieces. "What can you do that we haven't tried?" she asked. Both men looked at her. "Earning," she said, "beyond the cattle. What work is available that we haven't used yet?" Mason looked at Elias. Elias looked at the table. "Hartwell runs freight up to Billings," Elias said. "He's always short of drivers in winter because nobody wants to do it." "How much?" she said. $2 a run, maybe $2.50 in bad weather. How many runs per month?" 6, 7 if weather holds. Vivian did the arithmetic. "That's $12 to $15 a month." She looked at Mason. "You could do that." "The cattle still need—" "Elias and I can manage the cattle for the days you're gone," she said. Elias made a sound that wasn't quite objection, but also wasn't enthusiastic agreement. She looked at him. "I know you know this land better than I do. I'm not pretending otherwise. But I've been here 6 weeks and I can do the basic work. You'd only need to cover what I genuinely can't." Elias drank his coffee, said nothing for a long moment, then, "I can do that." "The school hours," Vivian continued, thinking aloud now, not performing confidence but actually working through it in real time, which meant some of it was going to be wrong and she'd correct it as she went. "I've been teaching mornings. I can add an evening session, adult classes, reading and arithmetic for homesteaders who never had schooling. There are families out here who need that and would pay something for it. Not much, but something." Mason was looking at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. Not the evaluating look, not the careful neutrality, not the almost humor. Something more direct than any of those. "And the sale," she said. "The remaining cattle. We sell them now rather than waiting for spring." "Now?" Mason said. "In winter the price is—" "I know the price is low, but cash now is worth more than cash in April if April means Pruitt cancels the agreement." She looked at him steadily. "We can rebuild the herd. We can't rebuild from foreclosure." The kitchen was very quiet. Mason sat with his hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table, at the embroidery on the wall, at Elias, at Vivian. There was something happening in his face that he was not accustomed to showing. Not the shutdown expression she'd seen in the snow, but something cracked open, the way ground looks after a freeze breaks. "I've been keeping this ranch alive for 2 years," he said, "by doing what I already knew how to do and expecting different results." He said it slowly, like a man reading something he'd written in a bad moment and seeing it clearly for the first time. "That's—" He stopped, shook his head. "It's what people do," Vivian said, "when they're scared. They go back to what they know." "I kept thinking if I just worked harder." "Harder isn't always the variable," she said. "Sometimes the problem isn't effort, it's direction." He looked at her, a long look, the kind that had something searching in it. "That's very schoolteacher of you," he said finally. "I've been a schoolteacher for 20 years, she said. "It comes out." Elias set down his cup with a small, decisive sound. "I'll go count what cattle we have left," he said. "Get a number for Hartwell." He stood up, reached for his coat. At the door, he stopped without turning around. "For what it's worth," he said, to no one in particular, to both of them, "this place was done before she got here. So whatever she's doing, it's better than what was happening before." He went out. Mason and Vivian sat in the kitchen with that statement settling around them like snow after a wind. "High praise," Vivian said after a moment. "From Elias," Mason said. "That's practically a standing ovation." And there it was. A real laugh, brief and rough. Not the almost laugh from the wagon, but the actual thing. It lasted only a second before it went back under, but it had been there. Vivian looked at her coffee and did not make a point of it, because making a point of it would ruin it, and she understood that some things needed to be allowed to come and go on their own terms before they could be claimed. The cattle sale happened 2 days later. Mason drove into Red Hollow with 14 animals, all that were healthy enough to sell, and came back with $223, which was considerably less than they'd hoped for in April and considerably more than nothing. Hartwell had tried to go lower, and Mason had, for the first time that Vivian was aware of, pushed back and held his number with a stubbornness that had apparently surprised Hartwell enough to make him reconsider. He folded on the third refusal, Mason said, setting the bills on the kitchen table. 3 is usually the threshold, Vivian said. Most people stop pushing before that. It's just discomfort, not actual impossibility. Mason looked at the money. Still not enough. No, she said. But it's the piece we had. We put the pieces together. She laid out the numbers on paper. The cattle sale. The first freight run Mason would do starting Monday. The 9-student grant payment coming in March. The small fees from the 2 adult learners who had already agreed to the evening sessions. The corrected balance owed to the bank. The restructured payment Pruitt had tentatively approved. The gap between what they had and what they needed was still real, but it had a shape now, and things with shapes could be worked on. She looked at the numbers until the kitchen went dark around her, lighting the lamp and continuing after Mason went to bed, checking and rechecking the columns the way she always did when she was anxious. Not because she expected to find errors, but because the act of checking kept her hands busy and her mind from sliding into the territory where things were impossible. At some point after midnight, she heard the floorboards in the hallway. Slow, careful footsteps that stopped outside the kitchen. She looked up. Mason was standing in the doorway in his work clothes, which meant he hadn't been asleep either. He looked at the lamp and the papers spread across the table and her in the middle of it. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. He came in anyway. He pulled the other chair out and sat down across from her and looked at the numbers she'd been working. For a few minutes, neither of them said anything, and the lamp cast its small circle of yellow light over the table between them. And outside the window, the Wyoming night was deep and dark and still in the way that follows a storm. The particular stillness of a world that has just finished being violent and is now catching its breath. "We're not done," he said. Not a question, more like a man testing the weight of a belief. "We're not done," she said. He looked at the papers for another moment. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen in the month and a half she'd known him. Not the gratitude from the barn, not the almost humor, not the grief she'd learned to navigate around. Something more unguarded than any of that. Something he hadn't entirely meant to show. He looked away before she could name it. "Good night," he said, and pushed the chair back and went to his room. Vivian sat with the lamp and the numbers and the silence and told herself firmly that she was here because of a practical arrangement between 2 desperate people, and that practical arrangements did not leave room for the particular kind of noticing she was doing right now, and that she should concentrate on the numbers. She concentrated on the numbers. Outside, the last of the storm's clouds moved off, and the stars came out over Wyoming in the way they did out here. Not the polite suggestion of stars you got in a city, but the full, relentless, uncountable fact of them, spread from horizon to horizon without anything in between to interrupt them. She didn't see it because she was looking at the numbers, but she felt it, somehow, the way the darkness outside the window changed quality when the clouds moved off, lighter and heavier at the same time, the way things sometimes were when they opened up. She closed the ledger. She went to bed. The months that followed the blizzard were the kind of hard that didn't announce itself dramatically. There was no single crisis to point at, no villain to blame, no moment where the bottom dropped out all at once. It was just the daily accumulation of not enough. Not enough money, not enough warmth, not enough food that was anything other than functional, not enough sleep for any of them. The kind of hard that grinds rather than breaks, which in some ways is worse because it doesn't give you a clean moment to react to. You just wake up every morning a little more worn than the morning before, and try not to count how many mornings are left until something changes. Mason started the freight runs the Monday after the cattle sale. The route Hartwell used ran northeast toward Billings through country that was, in February, essentially hostile to human movement, exposed ridge roads that caught every degree of wind coming down from the north, creek crossings that were iced over in ways that looked solid until they weren't, stretches of open plain where a storm could come up inside an hour and turn a manageable journey into something that required genuine luck to survive. Mason had done rough country his whole life, and he didn't complain about the work itself. What it cost him was time on the ranch, which meant Elias and Vivian carrying the daily operations between them on the days he was gone, which happened 4 times in February and 5 times in March. Vivian had told Elias she could handle the cattle work, and she had been, at the time, approximately 60% sure that was true. The actual figure, she revised privately, was closer to 40. She could do the feeding. She could break the ice on the water troughs and haul grain and do the basic checking that the animals required each morning and evening. What she couldn't fully do was read the subtler signals. the small behavioral changes that Elias cataloged instinctively after 40 years, and that told him when an animal was going off feed or developing a respiratory problem before the visible symptoms appeared. She learned to compensate by following Elias through the barn each morning and paying the kind of attention she gave to students she was worried about. And after 3 weeks, Elias told her, without framing it as a compliment, that she had better eyes than he'd expected. "Meaning you expected nothing," she said. "Meaning I expected less," he said, which she'd decided to take. The evening adult classes began in February with 2 students, a homesteader named Cobb, who could do basic arithmetic but had never learned to read beyond simple words, and a woman named Adeline Garrett, whose children attended the day school, and who came to the evening sessions after her husband had gone to sleep because he had opinions about the usefulness of education for women that Adeline had apparently decided to navigate around rather than through. By March, there were 4 adult students. By April, there were 6. The day school had grown to 11 children by the time the snow started pulling back from the lower fields. 11 children at $9 in territorial grants was $99 annually, plus the adult class fees which Vivian charged on a sliding scale. $1 a month for those who could manage it, 50 cents for those who couldn't, nothing for those who genuinely had nothing, which she absorbed because she'd been in positions herself where the difference between being able to access something and not was whether someone in a position to help chose to. 2 of the 6 adult students paid the full $1, 2 paid 50 cents, 2 paid nothing. The math on generosity wasn't perfect, but it was workable. What it wasn't, any of it, was fast. The money came in slowly, in small amounts, from multiple directions at once, and it had to be tracked carefully to mean anything. Vivian tracked it carefully. She maintained the ledger with the precision of someone who had learned that the difference between accurate and approximate, in circumstances like these, could be the difference between making a payment and missing one. The first restructured payment to Pruitt was due April 15th. On April 14th, Vivian sat down at the kitchen table and put together everything they had. Mason's freight wages over 2 months, minus what he'd put toward feed and basic supplies, $68. The cattle sale residual that hadn't gone to immediate expenses, $41. School grants, first installment, $49. Adult class fees, 2 months, $14. Total available, $172. Payment due, $200. She sat with that number for a while, to $28 short. Not catastrophically short, but short in a way that had specific consequences, because Pruitt's agreement had a clause she'd read 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. A 5-day grace period, after which the restructured agreement was void and the original foreclosure terms reinstated. She heard Mason come in from the barn, heard him pull off his boots, heard him fill a glass of water at the pump. She heard him come to the kitchen doorway and stop when he saw her face. "How short?" he said. She'd learned that he preferred directness to softening, and she'd long since stopped softening things for him. $28. He came in and sat down. He looked at the numbers she'd laid out, tracing the columns with his eyes without touching the paper. She watched him doing the same arithmetic she'd done, arriving at the same place. "I can do an extra freight run this week," he said. "Hartwell pays out Friday." "That's $2.50, maybe $3, she said. "It helps, but it doesn't close it." "I could ask Hartwell for an advance." "You could," she said. "He'd probably say no and then have leverage over you for the next 6 months. Mason pressed his mouth together. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, which was his version of pacing. $28, he said, as if saying it a second time might change it. They were quiet. The kitchen settled around them. The tick of the stove cooling, the faint sound of wind finding its way around the window frame, the particular quality of silence that a house gets when the people in it are thinking hard and not saying it. Then Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it by the brim in the slow, circular way he did when he had something to say that he was working up to. He looked at the table, at the papers, at the number Vivian had written at the bottom of the column. He looked at it for long enough that she understood he'd either seen it before she turned it over, or he'd simply added the numbers in his head. "I have $32, he said, in a tin under the bunkhouse floorboard. Been there since '87. He kept turning his hat. "You can have it." Mason stared at him. "Elias." "Don't," Elias said. The word was short and flat, the way he cut off things he didn't want to become speeches. "I've been on this land 20 years. If it goes to the bank, I've got nowhere to be either. He set his hat on the kitchen counter, brim up. It's not charity, it's investment. I want it back when you're standing. The kitchen held all three of them in a silence that was not uncomfortable but had a weight to it. The weight of something that mattered being done without ceremony, which was the only way Elias Boone knew how to do things that mattered. Mason looked at the table. His jaw moved. When he looked up, his eyes were doing something he didn't try to hide, which was unusual enough that Vivian looked away to give him room for it. I'll pay it back, Mason said. Every dollar. I know you will, Elias said. That's why I offered. He picked his hat back up. I'll go finish the north fence before it gets dark. He left. Mason sat for a moment with both hands flat on the table and his head down. Vivian watched him and didn't speak, and understood that some moments needed to be inhabited without being managed. After a while, he raised his head. His face was composed again, but something in it was different. A fraction more open, maybe, like a seam that had been pressed shut and was now just slightly apart. He saved up that money for 30 years, he said. It was supposed to get him to Colorado. I know, she said. He was planning to go before He stopped. Before all this started going wrong, he stayed because he didn't finish that either. Because people stay when they belong somewhere, Vivian said. He looked at her. That direct look, the one she'd been navigating around for 2 months because it had things in it she wasn't sure how to meet. You stayed, he said. I stayed, she agreed. After the blizzard, He stopped again, the way he did when he was trying to say something accurately and didn't want to get it wrong. I told you to leave. I meant it. When I said it, I thought you should go. I know you meant it. He paused. The word after it cost him something. I'm glad you didn't. It was not a declaration. It was not even particularly eloquent. But it was Mason Hale saying something true that he didn't have to say, which Vivian had learned was the highest register he operated in, and it landed in her chest with a weight that she acknowledged privately and didn't show. Go get Elias's tin, she said. I'll make dinner. He almost smiled. Not quite, but the shape of it was there. He got up and went out to the bunkhouse. The payment to Pruitt happened the following morning. Vivian drove into Red Hollow herself, while Mason did a freight run, presented the $204, 4 over, because she always paid slightly over when possible, it being a statement as much as a payment, and watched Pruitt mark the ledger with the expression of a man who had expected to be opening a foreclosure file by now and was adjusting to not doing that. You're current, he said. We're current, she said, and noted the we without drawing attention to it. She drove back to the ranch with the receipt in her coat pocket and the particular feeling of someone who has moved a very large rock 1 inch and understands there are many more inches ahead, but is satisfied with the 1 inch because it was genuinely hard. Spring came reluctantly, the way Wyoming spring always did. Not a seasonal change so much as a gradual argument between winter and something warmer, with winter refusing to concede the point without a fight. There were still freezing nights in May, still mornings where the puddles had a skim of ice. But the ground was softening, and the grass was trying, and Mason had used part of the freight money to buy 4 young heifers from a rancher 2 counties over who was downsizing, which was not a large herd but was the beginning of one. He was different in spring, not dramatically different. He was still a man of few words and careful distances. But the shutdown quality that the blizzard had brought out in him had receded. He worked with more of what Vivian could only describe as presence. He was in the work rather than just moving through it. Elias noticed it too, she could tell, though neither of them said anything about it directly because talking about the quality of Mason's inner states directly to his face was not something anyone on the Hale Ranch did. They found other ways to communicate. There was an evening in May when Mason came in from the north pasture to find Vivian at the kitchen table grading arithmetic papers from the morning's class, surrounded by the particular debris of a school teacher's evening, papers and a pencil and a cup of tea gone cold and a small, involuntary expression of genuine amusement at something a 9-year-old had written. He looked at the expression on her face and said, "What?" She showed him the paper. The student in question, the youngest McAllister boy, who was 8 and approached mathematics with a creativity that was charming and also not particularly accurate, had solved a subtraction problem by drawing a picture of a horse, apparently under the theory that visual representation might substitute for arithmetic when the arithmetic wasn't cooperating. Mason looked at the paper. The corner of his mouth moved. Is that a solution? It is not a solution, she said. It is, however, the most original response to subtraction I've encountered in 20 years. He sat down at the table, which he didn't always do in the evenings. Sometimes he went straight to bed after dinner, the physical exhaustion of the freight runs accumulating through the week in a way that was visible by Thursday. But he sat down and looked at the other papers with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, which led to a conversation about the individual children, which led to Vivian describing young Thomas Venson's remarkable memory for dates and numbers, and his complete inability to sit still for more than 4 minutes, which made Mason say that he had been exactly the same at that age, and his teacher had apparently threatened to tie him to his chair, which was the first time he'd told her anything unprompted about his own childhood. She filed it carefully without commenting on it being a first. He started doing it more after that. Small disclosures, nothing dramatic, just the incidental facts of a life offered in passing. The ranch he'd worked on before his father died. The first winter he'd spent alone on the land and how badly he'd underestimated it. A horse he'd had for 12 years that he'd apparently had more consistent emotional relationship with than most people. She received each one the same way, without making it into a moment, just letting it be part of the ongoing conversation of two people who were learning each other by degrees. Clara came up again in June. Not the way it had come up the first time on the wagon, accidental, quickly covered. This time Mason brought her deliberately, one evening when they were both on the porch after dinner watching the long Wyoming dusk do what it did in summer, which was take its time and be worth it. She would have liked you, he said, out of nowhere. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Tell me about her. He thought about it in the way he thought about things, not rushing it, letting it sit until it was ready. She was funny, he said. That's the thing people don't always know about her. People saw the rancher's wife and thought quiet, practical, serious. She was practical, but she was also... She could say something with a completely straight face that would make Elias laugh until he had to sit down. And Elias does not laugh. Vivian looked at the horizon. She sounds like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She always did, he said. Right up until she didn't. He paused. She got sick in the fall. By February, It was fast at the end. Faster than anybody told us to expect. He stopped. Let the silence do some of the work. I kept thinking if I'd noticed sooner. If I'd taken her to Cheyenne in September instead of October. If I'd... Mason, Vivian said. I know, he said. I know there's no useful place for that kind of thinking. I know it. Knowing it doesn't stop it, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. They sat with that for a while. The dusk moved slowly over the hills and the ranch was quiet in the specific way it got on summer evenings when the work was done and the animals were settled and there was nothing to do but be in the place. I'm not her, Vivian said. Not defensively, just as a statement of fact between two honest people. No, he said. And you're not the person I thought I was coming west to find, she said. He glanced at her. Is that good or bad? She thought about it genuinely, the way he appreciated, not reaching for the reassuring answer, but actually considering the question. He was a name on paper, she said. You're a person who sat on a hay bale with me at 2 a.m. in a blizzard because you didn't want the heifer to be alone. Those aren't comparable things. He was quiet for a long moment. Vivian, he said. Yes. He turned to look at her, full on, the way he rarely did, with none of the usual managed distance. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't know how to... whatever this is. I'm not good at it. Clara would tell you I was not good at it even when I knew what I was doing, and right now I don't know what I'm doing. Neither do I, she said. That's not very reassuring. I know, she said, but it's honest. He held her gaze for another moment, and then he looked back at the horizon, and she could see him making some internal decision the way you could always see Mason making decisions. Not dramatic, just a settling, a weight shifting from one side to the other. He stopped, started again. Over the winter. These last few months. He stopped a third time, which for Mason was practically a soliloquy's worth of false starts. You don't have to say it tonight, she said. I know, he said, but I think I want to. He looked at her directly again. I love you. I don't know exactly when that started or how it happened, and I'm not saying it to... I'm not expecting anything. I just think you should know it. Because we agreed to be honest, and that's the most honest thing I have right now." The porch was very still. Somewhere in the north field, one of the new heifers made a low sound that carried in the evening air. Vivian looked at this man, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, and the ones that had, at the hands that were never fully clean anymore, no matter how hard he scrubbed them, at the jaw that set when he was frightened, and the mouth that almost smiled when something genuinely surprised him, at the whole complicated, imperfect, real person sitting 3 feet away from her on a porch that was still missing a board. And she felt something come fully into focus that had been trying to focus for months. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You know?" "I know," she said, "because I feel it too." The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Not the silence of strangers managing proximity. Not the silence of two people working through a crisis. Not the silence of careful navigation around the things that couldn't be said yet. Just two people sitting next to each other at the end of a long day, in a place they'd nearly lost and hadn't, in a life neither of them had planned. Mason reached over and put his hand on top of hers on the porch rail. Not a gesture of drama. Not a movie moment. Just a hand, rough and warm, placed on top of another hand, in the ordinary evening light. She turned her hand over. They sat like that until the dark came. Summer on the Hale Ranch was a different animal from everything that had come before it. Not easier, exactly. The work didn't get easier. It just changed character. The brutal containment of winter gave way to the expansive, relentless labor of the warm months, which had its own demands and its own ways of grinding you down. Mason was up before the sun every morning and rarely inside before dark. The freight runs continued through July because the money was still needed and would be needed for a while yet. And on the days he was gone, the ranch ran on Elias and Vivian in a partnership that had long since stopped requiring negotiation about who did what. They'd worked it out over months of cold mornings and problem-solving, the way people work things out when circumstances don't give them the option of not working things out. But there was something different in how the place felt. Vivian noticed it first in small things. The way Mason fixed the porch board that had been soft underfoot since before she arrived. Not urgently, not in response to a crisis, just one Saturday morning because it needed doing and he had an hour. The way Elias started taking his coffee inside with them in the evenings instead of going straight to the bunkhouse after dinner, as if the gravitational pull of the kitchen table had gradually become stronger than his habit of solitude. The way the schoolhouse, which had started as a cold shed with a donated stove and second-hand benches, had acquired over the months a quality she could only describe as inhabited. Drawings pinned to the wall, a shelf of books she'd written to her former colleague in Boston, requesting and received, a coat hook by the door that the children used without being asked. These were not dramatic changes, but they were the kind of changes that accumulate into something real. The school enrollment reached 14 in September, which triggered a higher funding tier from the Territorial Education Board, a fact Vivian had known was possible and had structured the school's application to take advantage of when the numbers warranted it. The additional funds were not enormous, but they covered the cost of a second stove for the schoolhouse and left a remainder that went directly toward the next bank payment. Pruitt had, over the course of the year, undergone a subtle but perceptible shift in his manner toward the Hales. He was still formal. He was constitutionally incapable of being otherwise. But the careful wariness of a creditor managing a likely loss had given way to something closer to, if not quite respect, than professional acknowledgement. Every payment had arrived. Every payment had been slightly over the required amount. The account was performing better than his record showed any account in comparable circumstances performing in the previous decade. In August, he'd mentioned, in the passing way of someone mentioning something they didn't want to make a formal thing of, that the bank had received an inquiry from a settlement developer who was interested in land in the area. He'd wanted Mason and Vivian to know, he said, that the bank had no intention of facilitating any such inquiry with regard to the Hale property. He said it briefly and moved on to other business. Mason had waited until they were outside before saying, "Did he just tell us he turned somebody down on our behalf?" "I believe he did," Vivian said. "Huh," Mason said, which was his version of being genuinely surprised. It was the first time either of them had said our behalf, and neither of them pointed that out. But Vivian noticed it, and she suspected Mason did too. The anniversary of their courthouse wedding fell on a Thursday in October. Neither of them had said anything about it in the days leading up to it. It wasn't that kind of marriage, or hadn't been at the beginning, and the habits of the beginning were hard to fully shed even when what the marriage had become was something different. But Mason came in from the morning's work earlier than usual, which she noticed, and he had made an effort with his appearance that was slight but visible, in the way that effort is always visible in people who don't usually make it. Elias disappeared after breakfast without explanation, which she suspected was not coincidental. Mason sat down at the kitchen table and put a small package on it. Brown paper tied with the kind of string that came off a feed sack. Not fancy, not trying to be. "I'm not good at this," he said preemptively. "I know," she said, and sat down across from him. Inside the paper was a fountain pen. Not an expensive one, but a real one. The kind meant for actual use rather than display, with a solid brass nib and a good weight to it. She turned it over in her hands. For a moment, she didn't say anything. "You write in the ledgers every night," he said. "The one you've been using since you got here has a cracked barrel. I noticed in March." He paused. "I should have gotten it sooner." She looked up at him. "You noticed in March. It bothered me," he said, as if this were an ordinary thing to admit. Vivian set the pen down on the table and looked at it and thought about a man who was bad at the usual gestures, but had been paying attention to a cracked pen barrel for 7 months and had filed it somewhere in the back of his mind next to the things that needed fixing, because that was how he said things that mattered. Not in words when he could help it, but in the particular language of noticing and doing something about what he'd noticed. "Thank you," she said. "It's just a pen," he said. "It's not just a pen," she said. He met her eyes. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same way he'd put his hand over hers on the porch in June, returning the gesture with the same plainness it had been offered. He turned his hand over the way she had. They sat like that for a moment, at the kitchen table where she'd spread the first terrible ledger nearly a year ago, in the house that had smelled of empty and grief when she arrived and now smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and faintly of the chalk dust that she carried home from the schoolhouse on her clothes every afternoon. "1 year," he said. "1 year," she said. "Are you—" He stopped, tried again. "Do you regret it?" It was a real question, asked without the performance of already knowing the answer, and she gave it the consideration it deserved. She thought about the train platform and the bench and the trunk and the town women laughing. She thought about the frozen pump and the burned breakfasts, and standing in snow up to her knees counting dead cattle in the pale aftermath of a blizzard. She thought about the midnight ledger sessions and the Pruitt negotiation, and Elias setting $32 on the table without ceremony, and the afternoon she'd watched Thomas Svensson read a full paragraph aloud without stopping for the first time, his face going through something she recognized as the specific, irreplaceable feeling of something previously impossible becoming possible. "No," she said. "No qualifications?" he said. "No, but it was hard," or "there were moments." "It was hard," she said. "There were moments. But that's not the same as regret." She looked at him. "Regret is wishing it hadn't happened. I don't wish that." He was quiet for a moment. "Neither do I," he said. They had a simple dinner that evening, just the two of them, because Elias had conveniently remembered that he needed to make a trip into Red Hollow for supplies and would stay the night at the hotel. Whether Elias had a genuine reason to be in Red Hollow or had manufactured one out of the particular intelligence he had for when to remove himself from a situation was not a question either Mason or Vivian asked aloud. They ate by lamplight and talked the way they'd learned to talk over a year of shared evenings. Not about the ranch or the school or the bank. Just about things. Vivian told him about her first year of teaching in Boston. The school in a bad neighborhood where half the children came in hungry, and the administration's answer was to lower the passing threshold rather than address the hunger. Mason told her about the summer he was 19 and had ridden to Montana on a bet, and arrived to discover the bet had been about a different Montana town than the one he'd ridden to, and had spent a week doing hired work to fund the ride back. He told it without any performance, just as a story about a young man being an idiot, and it made her laugh. A real laugh. One that she didn't moderate, and the sound of it in that kitchen seemed to surprise both of them slightly with how natural it was. After dinner, they sat on the porch. October in Wyoming was cold at night, but bearable still, and the sky was doing what it did out here, putting on the full show, no half measures, every star accounted for. I need to tell you something, Vivian said. He looked at her. I wrote to the Territorial Education Board last month, she said, about expanding the school into a formal county-recognized academy. The enrollment numbers qualify us, and if we're recognized, the funding increases substantially, enough to hire a second teacher in the spring. Mason was quiet, processing this. You didn't tell me. I wasn't sure it would go anywhere, she said. I didn't want to raise something that might not materialize. And now, I got the letter last week. She kept her voice even, but barely. We're approved, recognized as the Hale Creek Academy as of January 1st. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Hale Creek Academy, Mason said. It needed a name. That seemed right. He looked out at the dark fields, at the shape of the land he'd almost lost and hadn't, and she watched something move across his face that he didn't hide from her anymore. Hadn't, really, since June. Clara would have... He started, and then he stopped, and this time the stopping wasn't avoidance. It was just the sentence being too full to finish. I know, Vivian said. Damn. He put his arm around her, which he'd done maybe a dozen times in the months since the porch in June, each time with a slight awkwardness that she found endearing because it was genuine. A man not entirely sure of the geography of tenderness, learning it by practice, getting better. She leaned into it. A second teacher, he said. Someone needs to take the upper grade seriously. I've been stretching myself across too wide a range. Where are you going to find a teacher willing to come out here? I've already written to a woman in Cheyenne, she said. A friend of a colleague. 34, experienced, apparently tired of city schools. She paused. She's considering it. Mason turned his head to look at her in the dark. You wrote the letter before the approval came through. I was optimistic. You were certain, he said. She thought about it honestly. I was mostly certain, she said. 60–70%. And if it hadn't come through? Then I'd have written a different letter, she said. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but kept getting closer to one the longer she knew him. You're going to be insufferable when you're right about things, he said. I'm generally right about things, she said. I know, he said. That's what I'm saying. She smiled into the dark. He tightened his arm slightly. Above them, the stars did their indifferent, beautiful thing across the full width of the sky. The ranch made its final large payment to Gerald Pruitt's bank on a Tuesday in November, 11 months after the restructured agreement had been signed in that careful, formal office. Vivian had calculated the final number 3 times, and Mason had checked it once, and Elias had looked at it and said, "That'll do," which was Elias for confirmed. It cleared the original mortgage balance by $6, which Vivian had engineered deliberately because ending at exactly the required number felt somehow like leaving something on the table, and she was constitutionally incapable of leaving anything on the table. Pruitt stamped the account settled, shook Mason's hand, nodded to Vivian with what, for Gerald Pruitt, passed for warmth, and that was the end of the thing that had been trying to end them for years. On the way back to the wagon, Mason stopped in the middle of the main street of Red Hollow and looked at the town around him. The general store, the post office, the saloon hotel, the railroad depot at the end of the street. The same street he'd walked down 14 months ago with his hands in his pockets and the full weight of a collapsing life pressing down on him from every direction. Vivian stopped beside him. You all right? She said. I'm trying to remember what it felt like, he said. Walking into town that day, thinking it was over. She looked at the street too. And I can't quite get back to it, he said. I know it was bad, but I can't feel it the way I could then. He paused. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's good, she said. It means you're not living there anymore. He considered that. I keep thinking about the bench, he said, platform bench, over there. He nodded toward the depot. When I walked past and saw you sitting there. You almost kept walking, she said. I did keep walking, he said, for about 4 steps. What made you stop? He was quiet for a moment. Those women laughing, he said. I didn't like it. That's all. He looked at her sidelong. Mostly, he said. There was also something about the way you were sitting, like you were not going to fall apart no matter what. but it was costing you something to hold that line. She was surprised by the accuracy of it. It was, she said. I recognized it, he said simply. They stood there a moment longer on the main street of Red Hollow, with the November wind moving around them, and then Vivian said, "Come on, I want to be back before dark." They drove the 12 miles home through the pale gold of a late autumn afternoon, the kind of light that made the plains look like something worth fighting for, which was accurate because they were. The land rolled out in every direction the way it always had and always would, indifferent to whether the people on it were managing or drowning or somewhere in between. The ranch came into view from the top of the rise. Vivian looked at it, really looked, the way you look at things you're trying to memorize. The house stood square and solid against the sky. The kitchen window lit from inside because Elias had gone ahead and started the stove. The barn roof had been patched in September and no longer sagged at the corner. The schoolhouse sat 100 yards back from the main house, its own small building with its own identity now, a wreath of dried flowers on the door that 8-year-old Annie McAllister had made, and presented one morning with the grave ceremony of a child doing something important. The fences were straight. She had made a point of noticing the fences, because the fences had been the first thing she'd seen when she arrived. The way they leaned in surrender. The way they said without words that the whole enterprise was done before it knew it. The fences were straight now. Mason had fixed them through the summer one section at a time, not all at once in a burst of effort but steadily, which was how he did everything, one problem at a time, refusing to be impressed by how many problems remained. "It looks different," she said. "From up here?" "From when I first came." He looked at it too. "It looks like somebody lives there," he said. "That's the difference." She thought that was exactly right. They went down the rise and pulled the wagon into the yard, and Elias came out of the barn wiping his hands on his rag and looked at them with the question in his face that he wasn't going to ask out loud. "It's done," Mason said, "paid in full." Elias nodded, said nothing for a moment, then, "I'll go finish with the horses." He turned to go, then stopped, turned halfway back. "Your $32, Mason said, before Elias could redirect. "Plus interest. It's in an envelope on your bunk." Elias looked at him. "Didn't need interest." "I know you didn't," Mason said. "That's why I added it." Elias stood there a moment with his hat in his hands and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was working to maintain his composure, which he prided himself on maintaining, always, and was currently not doing a perfect job of. "All right," he said finally, and went back into the barn, and the door closed behind him, and Mason and Vivian stood in the yard and listened to the quiet that followed. "He's going to sit in there for 10 minutes pretending to finish with the horses," Mason said. "I know," Vivian said. "He's been here 20 years, Mason said. He's saved this place as much as either of us did." "More than you'll ever fully say to his face," she said. "He'd hate it if I did." "Completely," she agreed. They went inside. The kitchen was warm, the stove doing its work, the lamp already lit. The embroidery was still on the wall, Clara's careful pattern in its frame. And underneath it, on the shelf that had been empty when Vivian arrived, there was now a row of books, a ceramic bowl that a student's mother had given as a gift, and the fountain pen in its small stand where Vivian kept it when she wasn't using it. The ledger was on the table, closed, with a pencil resting on top of it. The most recent entry, which Vivian had made that morning before they left for Red Hollow, showed a balance that was finally on the right side of zero. Mason looked at it. Then he looked at her with the direct, unmanaged look she'd come to know as his version of saying the things that didn't fit into words. She had thought in the early months that she understood the shape of what she'd gotten herself into. A practical arrangement. A working partnership. Two people using each other's competencies to solve a shared problem, with the clear-eyed honesty of people who had no illusions left to protect. She had believed she understood the terms. What she hadn't understood, what nobody could tell you in advance because it was only available through the specific experience of living it, was the way a practical arrangement between two people who were honest with each other could become, over time and difficulty, and shared 12-degree nights and kitchen arguments about feed costs and blizzard afternoons and the slow, particular education of learning someone's silences as well as their words, could become something that had no practical category. Something that was worth more than anything you'd set out to gain from it, She had come west looking for a second chance at a life she'd planned. She had not gotten that life. She had gotten something she hadn't planned at all, with a man she hadn't known existed on a piece of land she'd never heard of, doing work she'd never anticipated, surrounded by difficult conditions, and one quietly ferocious old ranch hand who had somewhere along the way become as close to family as anyone she'd known. She thought about the younger woman who had sat on the train to Wyoming, hopeful and anxious, and carrying the specific weight of someone who had done everything right and still ended up in the wrong place. She thought about what she would tell that woman, if she could. Not that it would be easy, not that it would make sense, not that she would find what she was looking for. Only this, that sometimes the life that saves you is the one you were trying to survive on the way to somewhere else. Hungry? She said. Starving, Mason said. Good, she said. Sit down. There's enough salt pork for both of us. He smiled at that. A real one. Full. Not the almost smile or the edge of one, but the actual smile, which she'd seen maybe 15 times in 14 months, and which she intended quietly and without announcement to be responsible for many more of. He sat down at the kitchen table. She went to the stove. Outside, the November wind moved across the Wyoming plains with its customary lack of consideration for human plans, bending the dry grass, testing the fence lines, doing what it had always done and would always do to this country. The schoolhouse sat in the dark with its coat hook by the door and its shelf of books and Annie McAllister's wreath, waiting for Monday. The barn was quiet, the horses settled, Elias somewhere inside doing something that had nothing to do with finishing with the horses. The kitchen window threw its light out into the yard in a yellow square, the way a lit window does, the way a lit window always does, in a house where people are home, making it visible from a distance, marking the place in the dark. Something was here. Not a perfect thing, not an easy thing, not the thing either of them had set out to find or anything close to it. Just a life, difficult and real, built out of a ledger full of errors and a train platform, and a 14-minute courthouse ceremony and a blizzard and $32 in a tin under a bunkhouse floor. Built out of honesty kept when it would have been easier to let it slide, and stubbornness applied in the right direction for once, and two people who had been given every reason to stop and hadn't. It wasn't a story about luck. It was a story about what happens when you run out of everything except the decision to keep going, and about the strange, unrepeatable accident of meeting someone else who made the same decision, at the same moment, in the same broken place. That was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. End of part 5. End of story.